Well, sticking with baseball, this is sort of an interesting statistic. If you look at the years, I've broken down the beginning of what we call the home run era, beginning around 1920 when Babe Ruth came on the scene. Babe Ruth, as you probably know, was a pitcher for the Red Sox, but he was also had the propensity to hit home runs even while he was a pitcher for the Red Sox, and he got traded to the Yankees in 1920 and started playing the outfield for the Yankees and started hitting home runs. Until then, home run leaders in the major leagues, like if you hit 8 home runs, you could lead the league back in those days, prior to Babe Ruth. But Babe set the mark in the 1920s. I think he hit 54 home runs in 1921, and then hit 60 in 1927, and ever since then, we've had a plethora of home run hitters. But starting in 1920, up to 1965, 46 years, we had the 50 home run per year, home run a year mark broken 16 times. Babe Ruth did it, I think, 3 times, and we had others who did it. Willie Mays did it, a number of other players, but 16 times over 46 years. Twice the 60 home run mark was broken, once by Babe Ruth and the other time by Roger Maris, who broke Ruth's record. Then you go through a period of almost 30 years, between 66 and 94, very few players challenged Roger Maris's record of 61. Very few came even close. One who, I guess one of them would have been Prince Fielder, who hit 50 or 51 one year. Cecil, I'm sorry. Cecil, yeah. Yeah, Prince also hit more than 50 on one occasion, but in those intervening years, Prince's dad hit 50 home runs. It only was done 3 times. Since 1995, and I use that as a year specifically, because the year 1994 will always be remembered as the strike year. Major League Baseball went on strike that year. Midway through the season, the players were playing without a contract, and the Players Association just decided they weren't going to play. There was no World Series that year. I don't think there was even an All-Star game that year. But starting the following year, 1995 up to 2010, over 16 years, 50 times, 24 times, the home run record was broken. The 50 home run mark was broken or reached. Now this looks a little strange, and the reason for this, a lot of speculation, nobody knows exactly why, but there's a lot of speculation that because of the strike, a lot of fans got turned off. They realized, well, we didn't have baseball for a half a year. We lived, we survived, we can do without it. And so the fans started staying away starting in '95. And the thought is that there may have been some thought here that by the owners and other powers that be in baseball that, well, let's let the players do their thing, take steroids, for example. We'll look the other way, and we'll start getting, as happened with Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa and some of the others, started hitting home runs. Fans started coming back to the ballpark. Attendance rose, money came in, and has been coming in ever since, actually. So people began to wonder about this. What's going on? How come so many players are hitting home runs, including players who were not particularly noted for their home run prowess, started hitting 40 and 50 home runs? What's going on? And that's when the book by Canseco started to come out in the early 2000s, and started, people began to wake up to the fact that steroids were being used rampantly in Major League Baseball. A couple of highlights here. The great pitcher for the New York Yankees, Andy Pettitte, admitted that he had used human growth hormone and had been given it by his trainer, who also happened to be, Pettitte claimed, also gave human growth hormone to Pettitte's teammate at the time, the great pitcher Roger Clemens. And this all came out as a result of an investigation by George Mitchell. George Mitchell was a senator from Maine, became majority leader of the Senate, and when he left that post, he gained additional fame by negotiating a settlement in the dispute between England and Northern Ireland. So he was highly respected. And Major League Baseball called upon George Mitchell to do a thorough investigation, leave no stone unturned of what was going on in Major League Baseball in the use of drugs. And he came out with his report in late 2007, and he named names. This was surprising, that he named names, dates, places, and two of the names that came up in his report were Pettitte and Clemens, and that led to a congressional hearing in which Pettitte, Clemens, and the trainer, who supposedly had given human growth hormone to both players, were called upon to testify. Pettitte says he knows that Clemens was given the drug. Clemens absolutely denied it. Clemens was actually tried in court for contempt of Congress, lying to Congress. And he was tried twice. Once was a hung jury, and the second time he was acquitted. They couldn't find ample evidence that he had actually lied. But that is another recent case. Here's some more from other sports. Marion Jones won 5 medals in the 2000 Olympics in Sydney. Discovered she had used performance-enhancing drugs. Her medals were taken away. Not only that, she was sentenced to 6 months in jail. So she served prison time as a result of lying about the use. Cycling. We talked about cycling earlier with the use of amphetamines, but cycling is one sport where endurance is paramount and in which there has been such an enormous number of accusations of people using performance-enhancing drugs. Some of those, for example, in the Tour de France, like Floyd Landis, who won 1 year. Lance Armstrong was basically a household name in the country. He won, I think, 7 Tour de France's in a row. He was accused on many occasions of using steroids, denied it every time, until finally he was confronted with the evidence and had to confess that he actually had used them, and all his titles were taken away. Landis was stripped of his titles, and even more recently, Alberto Contador, I believe he won 3 Tour de France's in recent years, was found to use steroids and was stripped of his medal. So, here's one case where it seems to be endemic in the sport. Well, let's look at the term doping. What does doping really mean? If you look in the dictionary, there's several definitions for doping, actually. For example, you can dope in a manufacturing process, like when you're making metal alloys, and you add a tiny bit of impurity to it to enhance certain characteristics of the metal. We call that doping. In sports, it's broadly defined as the use of drugs in an attempt to enhance athletic performance. The term in that context goes back to the Afrikaans language, in which a stimulant used in South Africa from a particular plant and mixed with alcohol, extract of a plant mixed with alcohol, was used in certain ceremonial dances, and the term sort of has stuck in that context. In modern parlance, there are several definitions of doping. Probably the most broad definition is that which is used by the IOC, the International Olympic Committee. And it's very broad. It refers to prohibited substances. It refers to prohibited methods. It refers to, for example, refusing to comply with an order or a request, if you want to put it mildly, a request or order to provide a sample, whether it's doped or not. Just the mere fact that one refuses to provide a sample is grounds for accusation of doping. Making oneself available for testing. This gets into what is generally called elite athletes. Elite athletes, world-class athletes, who are in a class above everybody else. These are your Olympic performers. These are those who stand out in a particular sport. And they are designated elite athletes. Once you attain that elite status, there is a requirement that you submit yourself for testing. And in many sports, it can be in competition or out of competition. Doesn't matter. You can be on vacation and somebody can knock on your hotel room door and say, provide you with a cup and say, here, give us a urine sample, we want to test it. It's unannounced in many cases. There's rules that govern this, but the general presumption is that once you're an elite athlete, that status also requires obligation to conform to the rules. So if you're an elite athlete, you have to notify the governing authorities for that particular sport where you're going to be. So in case they want to request a sample, they can do so out of competition. And failure to do that is considered doping. Even though you may be totally clean, you have to abide by the rules. Tampering with samples, for example, trafficking, don't have to actually be an athlete. Trafficking in it comes under the definition of doping. Or administering a prohibited substance to somebody. Aiding, abetting, encouraging, whatever. So it's a very broad definition that the IOC uses today. Now there are, if you look at the IOC's rules, you can go to their website. I'll give you the link a little bit later, but you will see that drugs, substances, are broken down into different categories. For example, there's a category prohibited, it says prohibited at all times. In competition or out of competition, doesn't matter. If you are found to have any of these substances, and this is only a partial list, by the way, you are guilty of doping. Notice what's on the list. Well, I mean, as we expect, androgenic steroids are going to be on the list, right? But human chorionic gonadotropin, growth hormone, is on the list. HCG and LH on the list for males only. Females produce that in much greater amounts because of control of the menstrual cycle, but finding it in a male in more than low levels is grounds for being considered doped.
What do they do to the male's body?
Pardon?
Do they take LH and HCG?
Take it from, they can do a blood sample.
Or is it a metabolite for like testosterone?
No, these are proteins.
Okay, so what does it do? Why are men taking LH and HCG?
Good question. Boost testosterone levels. Remember, testosterone and estrogen and androgen production is controlled by LH and FSH. Okay. So human growth hormone, insulin, brings up the interesting question, what if you're diabetic? Many athletes, including elite athletes, are diabetics. Insulin, of course, stimulates the uptake of glucose by muscle tissue, if you remember from biochemistry. So that could have an enhancement effect on performance. But as long as you're a documented diabetic, being controlled by insulin, it's okay. You just have to report that fact. So they don't want to deprive true diabetics of being the ability to engage in athletics. Erythropoietin, remember that stimulates red blood cell production from the kidney. That is a big, big substance in athletics, EPO. Beta agonists are on the list because they generally tend to have an anabolic-like activity. When used in fairly large amounts, they can have a, even though they're not steroids by any stretch of the imagination, they do have an androgenic-like activity. Antiestrogens, tamoxifen, for example, raloxifene, Vista, are prohibited. And that's because if one takes an androgen, remember from biochemistry, we'll see this a little later too, androgens are metabolized to estrogens, not the other way around. testosterone can be converted to estrone and estradiol, loss of the methyl group from the steroid ring. So if one is taking high levels of an androgen, you're going to get more estrogen produced, right? And you'll have, in male athletes, of course, you'll start to get a feminization of the male athlete, start to grow breasts, for example. So athletes who want to avoid showing the side effects of too much estrogen being produced will use anti-estrogens. That's why tamoxifen, Evista, and other anti-estrogens are on the list. Diuretics, we call these masking agents because diuretics obviously used to try to wash the drug out of the system. Probenecid, why would probenecid be on the list?
Kind of like displace.
Remember what probenecid does?
Probably competes with renal tubules.
Right, it competes with renal tubules, so to block the excretion of drugs that may be in one system. This was an old way of doing it. One could not very successfully use that today. But probenecid is on the list for that reason. And some substances are prohibited only in competition, like amphetamines now, prohibited, cocaine, I guess it's okay if you're a coke addict, except during the period of competition. Narcotics, marijuana, glucocorticoids, these are prohibited only in competition, not out of competition. And then some sports prohibit certain drugs. For example, in archery, that's one I know about, archery, you cannot use a beta blocker because beta blockers are used to control tremors. Obviously, you don't want tremors if you're an archer.
How about golf?
Pardon?
How about golf?
Golf?
They're like restricted.
I don't know that golf is
Tips of the putters, yeah.
golf is not it's not an Olympic.
Okay.
Not an Olympic sport as far as I know.
So any substance is legal on the course.
I suppose. And then there's other things like blood doping, which is where one removes red blood cells from yourself, store them away for a period of time. Red blood cells will last, what, about 3 months or so? 4 months, I think, at the outside. So you store them away and then re-inject them so you increase your red blood cell.
How do they catch people doing that?
By having a very high RBC count, I suppose.
Yeah, relative hematocrit count.
Yeah. Chromatic,
People just naturally have a high hematocrit?
Well, that's an interesting point too, because some athletes will train in, and it used to be a favorite place, like Denver.
Yeah.
Would train in Denver to increase their RBC production, and then they would go back to sea level. And
I've seen guys buying these masks that they wear while they work out and run and stuff that's supposed to like increase the oxygen demand or something. I'm not sure, so it's like making it harder to breathe.
Well, they're breathing their own expired CO2.
No.
So, I mean, that'll jack
It
it
just
up.
makes it harder to
Yeah.
breathe, kind of like a high altitude situation,
Yeah.
so it would jack up your, you know.
I think they would
Yeah.
probably be breathing their expired air, and that would drive up their RBCs.
I literally saw a guy at the gym a week ago, and he looked like Bane. Stupid to me.
then there's things like catheterization. This goes back sort of to the era back in the 1960s when the Russian women athletes were, they were really muscular, and there was even question in those days whether they were really women, and they demanded sex, proof of sex in those days. And what they were doing was they were apparently using steroids, and then they would catheterize the women just before they were to be tested, so they didn't have any steroid in the urine. Substituting urine, gene doping, this is now something that's on the horizon. You're probably going to hear a lot more in the future about gene doping because it is conceivable that you could genetically engineer an athlete to exhibit or express certain genes that would, for example, enhance testosterone production or something like that, naturally, by gene doping. Science, the journal Science had an article on that last year, on gene doping, so it was kind of fascinating. Testing for drugs. As I said, things were pretty lax until around the 1960 period, around then, when first tests for amphetamines came about in the 1968 Olympics, first time that drug tests were used in the Olympics. Then in the 1970s, the use of out-of-competition testing started taking hold. And probably the most interesting facet of drug testing happened in 1983. There's an analytical technique which combines liquid chromatography, well, you can use liquid chromatography today, LC mass spec, but in those days it was gas chromatography combined with mass spec in drug testing. And you can inject a sample, say, of urine or plasma into the GC mass spec, and you would get the peaks and you could identify which drug was in there. This was done in the Pan Am Games in 1983, but the authorities at the Games set up the testing unbeknownst to the athletes, anybody else. It was done secretly. So athletes who were arriving at the Games were asked to provide blood samples and urine samples. And they discovered drugs in these people. And they disqualified them from competition. So these athletes would get off the plane, they'd go to the village, whatever, be tested, provide a urine sample, and immediately be told to go home. And this was happening a lot, even before the games began. And people started wondering, what's going on here? Well, finally they had to reveal that they were using this new technique of GC mass spec to detect drugs. And that's what's been used, although tendency now is to use liquid chromatography instead of gas chromatography, but same principle holds. You can isolate out drugs and determine their breakdown pattern from the mass spec and know exactly what drug you're dealing with. And then another advance was the use of immunoassays, like radioimmunoassays, ELISA, for peptides. So things like EPO could be detected in. So now it's very sophisticated technology that can be applied in testing for drugs in athletes. Should we take a break here?
Yeah.